Welcome to America in Focus. I am Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today is Casey Harper, the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau's chief. The national debt has been a big topic of conversation and significant concern. The national debt now tops $31 trillion, on its way to $32 trillion. And Democrats join Republicans, some Democrats join Republicans this week in casting a key vote on essentially reining in President Biden's executive orders that would add to the national debt. What happened here?
You're right. This was really a big story. The bill in question isn't really that broad or sweeping, but to see nearly 60 Democrats, 59 Democrats voted for a bill to rein in the incumbent Democratic president when it comes to inflation and spending was pretty interesting, and it did get some pickup online. So it's the House voted on the REIN in Inflation Act. It passed 272 to 148 with, as I said, 59 Democrats in support. And the bill basically, it applies to executive orders that impact more than $1 billion. So just, something small doesn't require this. But for larger executive orders, it requires the president to release an official estimate of how this will impact inflation. So it requires, the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Economic Advisors to get together and say, hey, this executive order, for example, the student debt.
Student loan debt forgiveness.
Student loan debt would be an example of something the president really did unilaterally. It's going to have a big impact on the economy. He would have to actually estimate how much the inflationary impact this is going to have. So, one sense, OMB is somewhat trustworthy, but they are still part of the Biden administration or the incumbent president, whoever that is, their administration. And so often those numbers are a little rosier than maybe others. This is going to be a little more biased than something like the Congressional Budget Office, I'd say. But it's still, a way that Congress is using their power to put a check on the president and say, hey, your executive orders are getting out of control. We need to rein them in. And we need to know how this is impacting inflation, which is something we've talked about a lot. Inflation has soared since Biden took office. Food and energy prices in particular have really risen. And so to see dozens of Democrats get behind this, it says, wow, this is more serious than just a Republican messaging bill, which is what it seemed like at first. And I wonder, could this even pass in the Senate?
Right. So it's passed in the House and now goes to the Senate. And of course, it would still also need the president's signature to become law. But you referenced if this were to pass, something like this could be used, for example, on Biden's executive order to cancel up to $10,000 in federal student loan debt for those making less than $125,000 a year, but up to $20,000 in debt for Pell Grant recipients. That was done by executive order of President Biden. Congress did not pass that. So this is something that could be used in a case like this. But that the Biden's executive order canceling student loan debt also was challenged in courts, and the Supreme Court this week heard arguments in that case. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. It was really interesting listening to these arguments because it almost seemed, it's hard when you listen to these arguments, you're trying to read between the lines and what the justices say. Sometimes the justice can ask really hard questions, but then they vote in favor of the thing that they interrogated. So I'm always a little more reluctant than other media outlets to make assumptions about how justices feel based on their tone and questioning. But a few themes that arose were, it seemed almost as if the state, and they didn't quite do this, but they were also admitting that they couldn't really prove that the president had the legal authority to do this, to cancel this debt.
Do it without Congress's input.
Right. That most of the debate did not center around that idea, which is really interesting. What it centered around was whether the state bringing the lawsuit challenging the student debt actually had legal standing to do so. So it's kind of a more technical, nuanced argument. And to me, that communicated that the federal government felt their best chance to win this case was not really to focus on the legal authority of the president, because they didn't have much to point to in that regard, but to focus and to challenge the state's actual ability to sue in this case, because you have to have standing. You have to have been injured in some way. You have to prove that a law injured you, it's called injury, to actually file a lawsuit. And it's really hard to prove that giving someone else money actually injures you personally, legally. So this has always been a question with how this case was going to proceed. But anyway, still have to say the legal authority, I think, definitely seem to lean against the Biden administration. We've seen this, you remember the eviction moratorium. Biden did this eviction moratorium as law of the land. Then the Supreme Court's like, hey, you can't just make a moratorium on things with the stroke of a pen. I mean, so that's not the only thing Biden has kind of had his wrist slapped on. So if it's really going to come down to the standing on that Supreme Court case, but as you said, I mean, we're talking, it's nearly $500 billion. When it's all said and done, when you include all the cost of the deferment, interest payments, we're in the neighborhood of $500 billion.
Wow. And of course, another story you wrote on just briefly, Casey, because we don't have a lot of time this week, is that the cost of interest payments on the national debt is going to, it's huge already, but over the next decade, it could surpass what we spend on national defense, on national security.
Right. I mean, this was a really kind of an alarming story to me, and I can't believe more people aren't talking about it. But, Congressional Budget Office, they release these forward-looking projections for the spending, debt, the economy, all these things. And they found that we're going to spend about $10.5 trillion just on interest payments on the national debt in the next decade, which is an incredible amount of money and is actually more, as you said, than we'll spend on national defense in that time. So, or rather, our spending on interest payments will surpass our spending on the national debt. And actually, if you just keep the interest payments just keep rising, so we're not that far out from spending on the interest payments being the largest expenditure for the federal government.
Wow.
So, if surpassing even entitlements, it's not that's like. Medicare in 2044, we'll spend more money on the interest on the national debt than we'll spend on Medicare. 2050 is Social Security. So, and those are, of course, our biggest entitlements, and defense are, some of our biggest items. So, like, just the cost of having the debt is actually going to surpass the benefits Americans are even receiving from their tax dollars.
It's hard to wrap for the average American average consumer. It's hard to wrap your mind around $32 trillion with that many zeros in the number. But make no mistake, taxpayers are going to be on the hook for this. Taxpayers are on the hook for this. So this is an important story. Listeners can keep up with this ongoing story about the national debt and more at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening.
Freedom and liberty are important to all of us. If you're looking for civil, intellectual conversations with those shaping the future of freedom, try the Future of Freedom podcast with me, Scott Bertram. We speak with leaders across the country in the greater conservative and libertarian movements. In-depth conversations about where the next intellectual battles will happen across the country. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcasts.